Hello class, this is number 2 of the videos on bulimia nervosa and major depression. So in the last video I went over some of the general symptoms for those two disorders along with their prevalence, how often they show up. But diving into a little bit more of their prevalence with cultural and gender variations. So I'm on slide number 53. It has a picture of some heads on it. If you could go to that slide. I'm actually going to skip that picture because there's nothing there. That's just a bookend to show a difference in one section to another section. So the next slide is 54. What is the prevalence? The prevalence for these two disorders depends on where you are and also time period. So for major depression, which is on slide 55, major depression is sometimes called clinical depression here in the West. In other countries, they may call it something else. It is a mood disorder caused by the persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest. It's very common. More than 3 million cases are reported each year in the United States, and it is treatable. There is therapy and medication and things that can be done to help prevent it. It is estimated that, and this is on the next slide, that currently 121 million people suffer from depression worldwide. Cultural variation in the prevalence of depression may be due to cultural differences in stress, standards of living, and reporting bias. So one culture to another may not report as much. One culture to another may have higher levels of stress. We are not exactly the same from one nation to another, so the levels of major depression may be more or less across national lines. Prevalence may be influenced by exposure to war, rapid economic and political changes, crime, and discrimination. These things may increase the rates of major depression in some nations. There's also stigma, and this is on the next slide, number 57. In countries, in cultures where there is strong stigma against major depression, of course, that means that there's going to be less people that report it. They're going to want to avoid going to a therapist for it. They're going to avoid trying to get medication, and they're not going to reach out for help because there is stigma against having that disorder. Here in the U.S., there is some stigma. It's not as strong as in other countries, but we still have stigma against major depression. So what about the gender variation and the prevalence of major depression? Well, women are almost twice as likely as men to develop depression according to what we have documented. Women are more commonly diagnosed with major depression because they're more likely to report the symptoms. As far as we can tell, it happens more in women, but it may be that men are just not reporting. So therefore, they are not being represented in the data. There may be some factors that may make women more likely to have depression. There is a hypothesis saying that hormones play a role. Some psychologists think that depression levels in men and women vary because of sex hormones and estrogen and progesterone. But there's little scientific evidence that supports this. It's just a hypothesis. There may be other factors on the next slide. Other psychologists think that the higher rate of depression in females could be result of long-term dysregulation of the stress response system brought in by adverse childhood experience, such as sexual abuse. Women are much more likely than men to suffer from sexual abuse, and that may manifest itself later on in life as major depression. Then there's social cultural factors. In most societies, women have less power than men. Maybe not so much here in the West, but more in the Middle East, in African nations, in Latin American nations, women have less opportunity than in some of the Western countries. So that can be a contributing factor to more women having major depression. There is, on the next slide, which is the one with the rings on it, is slide 61. The hypothesis is the role strain hypothesis that suggests social roles and cultural influences contribute to a higher number of females being diagnosed with depression. In many cultures, women get married and become fully dependent on their husbands. They don't get the opportunity to make a lot of life choices for themselves. They are seen as part of their husband, and that can lead to some circumstances where they feel helpless. That doesn't give them power and doesn't give them opportunities. So it can break down self-esteem and can lead to depression. The other disorder is bulimia nervosa, sometimes just called bulimia. It's an eating disorder that is characterized by binge eating and then methods to lose that weight, like vomiting, and dieting at an extreme level where they don't intake any food or very, very little compared to what they need. It is common. More than 200 cases annually are reported in the United States alone, and there is treatment for it. There is some hypothesis. I'm on the next slide, which is 63. There are some hypotheses as to what is causing bulimia nervosa. The westernization hypothesis is that eating disorders seem to become more common after World War II. And after World War II, of course, the United States became a juggernaut. It became a high influencer around the world. And with it, we changed a lot of cultures around the world. The ideal female physique became copied of what was the Western standard here in the United States. So we see in some of the cultures that are non-Western currently, as they start to become more Western-like, more like America, the numbers of bulimia nervosa increases. So our culture tends to influence and increase in this disorder. On the next slide, which is 64, Becker et al. Looked at some of this in the Fiji women. They cataloged and surveyed, followed some teenage girls in Fiji after the introduction of television from Western shows. And the study began in 1995 and ended in 1998 after television had been available for 3 years. At the beginning of the experiment, the ideal body weight, based off of the surveys, of a Fiji woman was robust, larger body type. But after those 3 years, the average started to change to thinner. What was the ideal thought for them was a thinner frame. So Western television must have had some influence on what they thought was ideal. Also, their cases of bulimia nervosa increased. The results show the increase in dieting and self-induced vomiting to control weight climbed from 0 in their participants in 1995 to 11.3% in 1998. Not everything in American culture is good for the rest of the world, I guess, is a lesson that we could learn from this. Researchers believe that increased globalization and exposure to Western media could explain the increase in symptoms related to eating disorders for non-Western countries. The study could support the idea that bulimia is cultural bound syndrome, that it's something to do with the culture. If you adopt the culture that pushes towards thin body types, then you're higher risk of having this disorder. The next slide, which is number 66, looks at males and females with bulimia nervosa. In males, it's generally less likely to show up in males, but it still does. Certain subpopulations of men are more likely to develop our disorder of bulimia nervosa, like wrestlers and jockeys and homosexual males are at the top of the list. But in recent years, it's increased beyond small numbers in males, and it is increasing fast. In females, it's much more likely to see bulimia nervosa than in males still, but the males are catching up. Young women between the ages of 10 and 19 are the highest risk. That's the group that tends to show this disorder most often. And there is some subpopulations of females that have this more often than the average. our ballerinas and our models suffer most from bulimia nervosa. If you're curious about that picture on the top left, that's a young man on the left when he was suffering from bulimia nervosa and after he was treated. So you can see that he gained some weight, but gained weight in a good way. He is healthier now. So, what can we do about these disorders? Well, there's treatments. There's biological, individual, and group approaches to treating these two disorders. I'm on slide 68, and one is SSRIs for major depression. SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's a pill medication that you can take that blocks serotonin from being reabsorbed by neurons, which I mentioned in the previous video. That will increase the levels of serotonin. Prozac is one of a few different medications that does this, trying to increase the levels of serotonin. The results from SSRIs do find that there is some promising effects, but it is slow going. I have the results there in bullet points list on that slide and also on the next that you could pause the video and you can look over. The next way of treating our major depression is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy looks at trying to redirect our thoughts and our behaviors. So trying to treat the person mentally, what's going on in the mind, and also their reactions. So step one is identify the correct faulty cognitions, the bad ideas, and unhealthy behavior, trying to fix both of those two. And step two is increase activity and learn alternate problem-solving strategies. So increase good activities, and when a person runs into, let's say, major depression, or this could also apply to bulimia nervosa, what would be a good problem-solving strategy to fight against those negative thoughts? There's also interpersonal therapy, which is on slide 71, and some data related to that that you could pause the video and you could look over. But stereotypically, one of the main forms of therapy that you're aware of is group therapy, where everyone sits around and they talk about what's going on. In group therapy, therapists will meet with a group of people. Sometimes it will just be the clients, or it could be the family and friends of the one suffering from the disorder, trying to inform all that they can and to try to encourage the person and show them that they have support. Typically with people suffering from major depression, bulimia nervosa, they feel alone, they feel isolated, and a group therapy or group treatment is a great way of showing them that they're not standing alone, that they have resources and they have people that have been where they are. You've probably seen that enacted in many movies. It is a real thing. There is actually support groups here in Sumter for some disorders. On the next slide, which is 73, MBCT to treat depression. MBCT is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And this is a therapy that was developed not too long ago. It is a new one, more or less, and the aim is to prevent people from becoming depressed again or relapsing after successful treatment for major depression or bulimia nervosa. This incorporates some new ideas like meditation and relaxation techniques for a person that may be very anxious. So if a person is wanting to fall into a depression slump, this would encourage them to go into a meditation, take a moment, take a break, and reset your thoughts. So on the next slide, which is slide 74, what about medication and mindfulness behavior cognitive therapy? I have some data there that looked at people that would get one or the other, or maybe both. And interesting how the results turned out in this study. Maybe it wasn't big enough of a study to see a lot of correlation or causation, but nevertheless, this was a good start to see if they have any major effects. And then I have a slide of some videos that I will hopefully remember to attach to this one so you can see them, from ASAP Science and Crash Course. Of course, there is biomedical approaches to treating depression. There is pills that can be taken to change your mood, like, for example, that Prozac was a serotonin booster. It blocks that serotonin from being reabsorbed. There's also medication for those that are bulimic nervosa, although it is not as strong. Usually therapists were going to go the route of actual going to therapy, going to counseling for bulimia nervosa. There is individual approaches to treatment where a person can go one-on-one with a counselor. There is group approaches where there's group therapy for people that can seek help. And more resources than what I have here on the slideshow. What I want to do is stop on slide 79 before going to number 80. Number 80 will be its own video. But for now, I think I've covered enough in the notes. Hopefully you followed along in the slideshow and maybe pause this video when you wanted to read something. And I will post another video to finish out the rest of these notes. Have a good day.